thank you very much indeed for attending this evening. We appreciate it's a drizzly, rainy, rather cold day outside, so thank you for bringing yourselves here to us at RBS. I will, well, the first time we've actually got a webcast happening, so the reason there's a lot of equipment at the back, hello to everybody who's logged on and watching online. This means that anyone who's outside of this room, whether they're in the UK or outside, can actually webcast and join in. And the reason we wanted to do that is, as a group, Radius is really focused on trying to show that diversity and inclusion should be core to most businesses. And the question we got asked quite a lot is, what are the ways in which we can do that where we engage with people who are not physically in the room? So it's the first time we've done it, and we're really excited to be doing this. I've got my iPad on my knee where there are questions which might crop up live. So every once in a while, I apologise if I look down, but I'll be just checking. I'm not checking my Gmail. I'm actually checking to see if any questions have come through. You'll also notice there's a gap next to me. Chris Smith has just finished voting at the House of Lords, so he's hot-footing it over here. So if you see someone walking past you, don't be tempted to stop them or hold them on their way. He'll come and join us, and I'm sure he'll join in with aplomb as we continue through the conversation. So without further ado, I was actually going to ask the panel to introduce themselves, as they can probably do a much better job than I can. Starting with Steve over there, we're going to give everyone 30 seconds to a minute just to explain who you are, where you work, and what your interest in this topic is.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm Steve Hargreaves. I work for EDF Energy. We're the largest supplier of low-carbon energy in the UK. I personally have been in the electricity industry all my working life. I joined the Central Electricity Generating Board, would you believe, in 1987 as a graduate trainee. So I experienced privatisation and deregulation, the famous pool, and all of that. I've worked upstream and I've worked downstream in my life, and I find myself as Corporate Strategy Director of EDF Energy, whatever that means.
Thank you very much indeed. Jeremy.
Jeremy Nicholson, Director of the Energy Intensive Users Group, which is an umbrella group representing a dozen or so sectors of heavy manufacturing, big gas and electricity consumers in the chemical industry, steel, paper, glass, ceramics and so on. Still a relevant part of the economy, at the head of a number of supply chains in British and European manufacturing. I'm very concerned about security of energy supplies and indeed the relative price of energy here compared with the rest of Europe and internationally.
Thank you very much indeed. Andrew.
Good evening, Andrew Buglass from RBS. I run our energy structured finance team as sort of the host. I'm delighted to see you all here in RBS. Thank you for joining. I've been in and around the energy sector for about 23, 24 years now in a variety of places, most recently with RBS, but that included about 10 years on the developer side. I spent some time with PowerGen, and I spent some time working for an oil and gas company. It's always been around financing for the sector, pretty broad range, both geographic and technology. So a lot of renewables these days, a lot of thermal in the old days. RBS focused very much on lending to the UK power sector, principally renewables at the moment, because that's very much what our clients have been looking to finance. And in 2011, 2012, we lent more to the renewable energy sector in this country than any other bank. So we're pleased with that. We're hoping the same story we can tell for 2013. We don't have the numbers yet, but looking to do a lot more and continuing the debate.
Thank you very much indeed. Nick.
Good evening. I'm Nick Butler, a visiting professor at King's College London, working on public policy. I joined BP from university in 1977, not intending to stay very long, and left 29 years later, having been head of strategy. I then went to work in government as senior policy advisor to the Prime Minister in Number 10. That came to an end, and then I went to King's, and I write the energy and power blog for the Financial Times.
Good. Thank you. And Alison.
Hello, my name's Alison Austin. I work for Robertsbridge Group, which is a sustainable development consultancy, which is quite young. It's only 4 years old. Before the 4 years, I worked for Sainsbury's, so I spent 25 years at Sainsbury's, so I'm afraid if you still cut me, I bleed orange in retail. I headed up the environment side there for 18 years, so I suppose I've been working in the environmental side of sustainability for about 22, 24 years now. I'm passionate about energy efficiency, which is mostly unsexy, but very important. I've also tried and practice what I preach at home, so I've been revamping my house and experiencing all the aggro and hassle factor that consumers do with Green Deal assessments. So I have personal scars and wounds to bear on that front. But I also do work in terms of a community solar schools initiative and a wood fuel cooperative in my local area as well.
Good. Thank you very much indeed. As some of you who've been to Radius events before will know, we try and have these discussions as an open forum. So whilst we have a number of topics that we will cover, the panellists may well interject and make points to each other. And equally, if you've got particular points or questions you'd like to ask, either raise your hand or try and catch my eye. And at the relevant point, I'll make sure that you're brought in, because we think it's important to make sure that if there's questions or points you want to make, we try and bring them in. Equally, if you're watching on the webcast, if you email, every 5 or 10 minutes I'll check my email and make sure that we're covering any questions we've got online as well. I thought it would be sensible to start, given that there's a mix of people in the audience, not all experts in energy. Maybe Nick, to give some background about what you're seeing, I suppose, in the wider political environment, both in the world of politics, but also in what's happening with oil demand and the green energy debate from your perspective.
Okay, thank you. Can I say, first of all, it's a great pleasure to be here. And I'd like to thank RBS for hosting this. I think it's the first time I've ever spoken in a bank that I am an owner of.
That makes two of us.
I think the energy debate has changed quite a lot over the last 5 years and has not settled down to a new consensus. I think 5 years ago there was pretty much a consensus around a global deal driven by fears of climate change. Around a progressive reduction in emissions and a change in the energy mix, particularly in the generating sector, and a sense that that was the top priority. I think it's changed for a number of reasons. Firstly, there isn't a global deal, and Europe now looks way ahead of every other part of the world in making cuts and changing its own energy mix. I think, secondly, because of the recession, there is much greater concern with competitiveness and jobs than there is with climate change. Rightly or wrongly, climate change is not now one of the top 10 issues when the opinion pollsters ask people what they're concerned about. I think that's regrettable, because the reality is that there still is climate change. It's more about climate volatility than about a steady increase in in temperatures, but it's still there. And I think the other thing that's changed is technology, because against the expectations, which 5 years ago would have been that oil and gas are both increasing in price inexorably because of increasing global demand driven by population growth and spreading prosperity, now the technology, starting with shale gas, but then tight oil, which is oil from shale rock, and many other advances, are meaning that there is actually more supply than we expected. And prices are not the fear that they were 5 years ago. And so I think that's the uncertain context in which the policy debate is taking place now.
And Jeremy, from your perspective, you obviously represent users of large amounts of energy. Are they feeling, or are they approaching this in a different way to they were 5-10 years ago? And how does politics affect the way they interact, or is it purely a price-driven discussion at the moment?
Well, the economics of energy-intensive industries, you might expect, are very much price-driven, and it's about expectation of where relative prices are going to be. And it's not so much about absolute prices, which plainly matter for economic growth and fuel poverty in the domestic sector, but relative price, where our prices are here compared with elsewhere. We continually have regional rather than truly international gas markets and very localised electricity markets, and the price disparities, even before you look at add-on costs from regulation, can be very significant. And that naturally affects where multinational businesses that are competing in international markets are inclined to vote with their investors' feet, or whatever the appropriate analogy is, in terms of where their money is going. And I think the concerns that Nick's outlined is absolutely right. The political debate around energy, I would say is actually more balanced. I think it's where it ought to have been 5 or 6 years ago when we were committing ourselves to hugely ambitious targets for 2020. If you care about the sustainability of the green agenda, you should also care about it being politically and economically sustainable. Now, I know no one would have predicted with certainty in 2006, 2007, the previous report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and Al Gore's film and the Stern Review on the economics of climate change. No one would have predicted then we were just about to go through the worst industrial recession in living memory. And that's focused mind as well. It's not a good thing that the recession has cut emissions, but one good thing that comes out of difficult circumstances, it does concentrate minds. And I think, whatever emerges from the debate on here will actually be more secure in terms of where we're going, because those hard questions about what can we afford and where should the costs lie, what balance should be paid by industry, the domestic consumer and the taxpayer, and all those questions that were dodged initially.
And energy security comes up again and again. We've obviously got markets and pricing, but Steve, from EDF's perspective, I presume both you as a provider and supplier of energy to businesses and consumers, but also as a firm that's involved in the global energy market. What's your view of the world security perspective for energy supplies? Because that crops up a lot in geopolitical terms.
Yeah, it's interesting, this tension, if you like, between low carbon and security of supply and affordability. And actually, when you really break it down, I'm not sure that there's so much tension as people would like to make out. I think there's a huge overlap between some of those objectives. If you look at what's driven bill increases in the UK in the last decade, everyone talks about it being low carbon energy and green policies, but actually the biggest driver is a threefold increase in gas price. And we haven't got a low gas price in the UK at the moment. It's even with all of this oversupply, all of this global stuff. I think when I look forward, gas. There is a lot of gas supply out there. Nick's absolutely right. There's been lots of new discoveries. But if you look long term, because we're making decisions in our energy policy for decades, not years. So as we replace the plant that's closing down, we replace the old coal and the old gas. We're making decisions for decades. And if you look very long term, demand is going to grow. There's something like 15% of people in the world that don't have access to mains energy. Economies are developing at a great rate. That will emerge from the recession. And when you add all those things up, the core things that you should do. Energy efficiency, save energy, absolutely. That ticks all of the boxes. Actually diversify so that you haven't got all your eggs in one basket. That ticks a lot of the boxes. Build low carbon generation with stable prices that diversifies your energy sources. I think there's actually a reasonable alignment. If you look long term, between those tensions.
And that point about, I suppose, it seems like what you're saying is about certainty. So one of the conversations that I know crops up a lot is around subsidies for green energy. Andy, when you're looking at the clients you're working with and major infrastructure projects, what's your view on both the balance of what subsidies should be available and if that distorts the market, but also how that does or doesn't guarantee certainty for some of your clients who are looking to finance those projects?
Yeah, that's an extremely good question. I think that the reality is that we've come a long way. When you look at low carbon generation, if we look particularly at something like onshore wind, which is the most developed of them, it started 30 odd years ago, very expensive, requiring huge subsidy. In some countries already, Brazil, New Zealand, other places, it is already at or very close to grid parity, so it doesn't need subsidy. Getting closer and closer here as base energy prices rise. And what's very interesting is there are all sorts of things that are outworkings from the impact of subsidy. So as I look at my own business, which is financing energy projects, we are not determining what percentage of particular technology we're going to finance. We finance things that our clients bring to us If we feel that the projects stack up, we finance them. And the bulk of what we've done over the last 3 or 4 years has been renewable, because the fact is that with the combination of low wholesale market prices and where gas prices have been, the margin on a gas plant hasn't been sufficient to encourage people to build new ones, typically. So you've got a shift away from that, because the economics have been, if you like, distorted somewhat by the subsidy element, and there has therefore been a very significant uptake in renewables. And this is indeed the policy intervention that governments have decided they want to do. If you look at Germany, for example, huge investment into solar photovoltaic, and talking about consequences which may not have been fully intended, that almost in and of itself drove down the cost of photovoltaic panels on a global basis significantly, so that actually other countries have arguably benefited from the excess that the German consumers have been prepared to pay to move to a more low-carbon energy. Now, I think that we certainly, when we're appraising projects, we always try to do so on the basis of how would the project look without subsidy. And actually, it's not necessarily as stark as you may think, particularly for onshore wind, which, is, as I say, is the most cost competitive of the technologies at the moment. We have heated, occasionally, debates with our credit colleagues. They're very challenging, as they should be. And there is a natural skepticism that why would I lend money to a project which is reliant on a government subsidy which could be taken away in future. We've seen it happen in places like Spain, in Portugal, lots of Eastern European countries as well. And the argument is, well, what's to stop a future government doing the same thing here? I think we've actually had a pretty solid track record of never having retroactive change in the UK, and long may that continue. But on the back of that, we've done analysis that says, okay, how far can you actually reduce the level of subsidy before it can't service the debt that the project has? And it's pretty robust, in fact. So I think that...
Does that suggest the subsidies are overly generous?
No,
that's
because...
a suspicion of consumers.
Well,
I understand that's attractive for investors.
And I think that's a very fair challenge, but the reality is that the way these things are financed, you have shareholders in that project who are providing 30-40% of the capital, and they're the ones who are first to not get a return on it. So if we're still getting paid our debt on the project, but the subsidies have reduced dramatically, then actually the shareholders in the project are indeed the first to bear that loss.
And Chris, when you're debating this with both national and international colleagues in the political world, does certainty of price and supply, or how high up in the debate is that in terms of your role and what the government's trying to influence? Is that key to what they're trying to do, is provide a 5-10 year certainty of both supply and price? Does that crop up?
It's certainly one of the issues in play. One of the problems in all of this is that for the various parts of the power industries, they need long-term certainty in order to plan. Now, in making a decision about whether you're going to build a nuclear power station or whether you're going to invest in carbon capture and storage, that is a major decision involving huge sums of money, and you have to base it on a reasonable certainty of assumptions about cost and value and income streams in the future. It would help enormously in all of this if there were genuine cross-political party agreement in helping industry to plan.
And is that likely to arrive, do you think?
There are elements of it there already, but not enough. In terms of renewables, which tend to be on a smaller scale, the equation is more difficult to judge. Where the you're right, the relative generosity of initial feed-in tariffs has been effective, is in getting movement off the ground. And you need that generosity in order to get things going. When you start to get real production at scale, and particularly when you get the German type effect, then you can begin to bring down some of those generous incentives. But you need those incentives to get things moving in the first place.
So Nick, the question for you is, should more be done then at a European level or a UK level or national level, international level? What are the different, from your policy perspective, do you have a view as to what level of government those discussions should be happening to enact that kind of long-term certainty?
That's such a big question. I'll just take one aspect of it and let everybody else go at the other things. I think the most important thing we could do now is invest in science. And I think I would hope that the science would produce renewables, either the existing technologies or different technologies, advances in energy storage such as batteries, the use of advanced materials so that instead of this room being about 10 degrees too hot, it could be moderated down, the lighting could be adjusted properly. All that is possible. I think science has advanced a great deal, but I think if we put a great effort now into, across Europe and indeed internationally beyond that, into the next generation of science on 2 or 3 of these key technologies, you would help to resolve the problem, because at the moment renewables don't quite compete unless they have subsidies. The subsidies are vulnerable because they're about public policy. If you had a set of renewables that actually competed on their own without the subsidy, then the whole energy scene would be changed.
Alison, you had a point you wanted to make.
I just want to put a slight spanner in all that lovely works by saying that unless you've got the engineers to install and maintain such lovely, sexy technology, it's for naught. And there aren't enough engineers out there now to look after the type of renewable energy technology, smart, clean technology that's in buildings, premises, factories now, let alone in 3, 5, 10, 15 years' time. So my plea in terms of public policy is education policy in terms of science, literacy and communication skills. Because unless we can get to 9, 10, 11-year-olds now, we are not going to have useful 16-year-olds, 18-year-olds, 22-year-olds, graduates, doctorates, whatever, by the time we get to 2030. Because what we do now affects what life will be like in 2030. And so my plea is, that all sounds lovely, but unless Department of Education and Skills is playing, we're for naught.
It's not just doing the education bit. I was talking earlier today with the UK and Europe and Middle East the chief executive of a major engineering company. He was saying that the top engineering graduates coming out of Imperial College now, virtually all end up working in the city and not in engineering. So it's not just about educating more people with engineering skills. It's about then making it much more attractive for them to remain as engineers.
Career paths and flexibility and playing to their appetite for innovation and exploration.
Well, moving on in the conversation, we talked a little bit about some of the technology that's coming out that might impact both consumer and business, and you had some views on what Google's doing and what they're trying to do with technology. So that seems to be a good example of where a traditional engineering career might not go the route that one might have originally
Analysts and technology and IT, yes. I mean, I have a soapbox which is about energy efficiency not being sexy, and businesses don't pay enough attention to it. But you row around your estate and you can always find improvements which help your bottom line. But I'm always very concerned about why energy efficiency at home, because we talked about use less energy and the debate about pricing in the public media and the political arena and capping energy prices, policies to be, etc. It's all a bit diversionary from we need to use less, but to use less is actually an enormous hassle at the domestic household level. and I'm somebody who understands a bit about it, and I try and practice what I preach. I've invested and I've made changes, and it's still difficult to impact on your bill. It really is difficult. But you hear that, was it last week, that Google paid 400 million or whatever it is, an amazing price for a small startup company in the States called Nest, which has this very exciting, very attractive. So this is where design and aesthetics needs to play in energy efficiency. They have a very interesting little sort of monitor in your house, and it learns from your energy behaviour, and it's linked to your smartphone, and it's linked to a number of devices in your house and your heating system, and you can remotely tell it what to do and when to switch things off and when to switch things on, and it learns. And it has this, now there's a new phrase that's come around now, what is it? You can find energy or spare energy, or you drag it into a savings box. So instead of leaving the heating on for an hour too long because you went out to work earlier at 7 o'clock as opposed to 8 o'clock, or 6 as opposed to 7, it knows you're not there because your phone is gone, so it's linking you with GPS, so it switches it off. These are the sort of things that we don't want to do.
Or if you forget your phone, it keeps the heating on all day.
But then you've got even more problems if you've left your phone behind. So I think we need to have some hope that there will be IT people who will look at your phone. It's not more than just a phone. You've got tablets, which are your devices for entering a digital world, and it will impact on our home. So it's linked to this whole Internet of Things, which is coming through. So I'm more hopeful about that.
But it might take a little bit longer time.
It might take a little bit longer than I want it to.
Are there any questions from the floor? I haven't had any in by email yet. I'm sure there's some on the way. But does anyone have any comments or questions? The way we're trying to split this is perhaps to cover a high-level view of the energy and energy markets. And I appreciate we can't dive into detail in those particular areas. But if anyone's got any questions, you're welcome to pose them to the panel. And if you could also say who you are and the organisation you're from, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
I hate to say who I am. I'm from the Department for Education, but I'm not going to answer a question or ask a question about education.
That's fine.
I was actually going to ask about the recent government award of contracts in the new nuclear sector. And I read an article recently that compared the price, the guaranteed price that was being offered to the people investing in those nuclear power stations compared to the European sort of norms at the moment. And there was a vast premium that was being offered to those investors who were going to be building those new nuclear power stations. And I wondered about the subsidy point and the incentives that the UK government has had to offer to bring in that investment. And is that because we're soft at negotiating, or is that a real price that we have to pay?
I don't know, Steve, you look like you might have an answer to this for media, but then Nick, we'll come to you straight after. Thank you for that.
I can tell you that it's not a soft negotiation. I mean, the price that's been agreed for Hinkley Point C, actually, it's not a price for this decade. It's a price that will start in 2023. So customers, won't pay a penny towards that price until 2023. And actually, if you look out to that point, then the price is actually competitive with any other form of large-scale low-carbon generation. But it's also competitive for you to build a gas power station at that date as well. So it's a competitive price for power in the next decade. And when you look at it compared to a CCGT, there are a lot of additional benefits. So there's a carbon benefit. You save 9 million tonnes of carbon every year from this compared to a CCGT.
So can you just explain the acronym, if you can, just so people...
Sorry, CCGT is a gas-fired power station. Sorry, thank you for doing that. But you save something like 5% of UK gas imports by having this project. It's 7% of UK energy by itself at a stable price, and it is competitive. But then the other thing that is interesting to look at is actually this jobs impact. Because you're spending the money in the UK, the vast bulk of the money that for a nuclear power station is actually the construction of it. And an awful lot of that is in the UK. Okay, you're buying some equipment, but an awful lot of the spend is actually engineers, people constructing. So the economic effect and the economic benefit of effect compared to building a gas power station, which most of the cost is actually in the gas that you import, is enormous. And then if you add this, to bring this back around to education, actually, if you knock on these big projects have the potential to be hugely inspirational. We saw it with the Olympics and the Olympic Park and all those things. And we're doing a huge amount in the local community around Somerset to actually get school children, young adults, people unemployed actually interested in engineering, in jobs, so looking at it in the round, it's a great thing to be doing.
So I suppose the question was also about subsidies and whether that was the right use of subsidies. But Nick, you wanted to make a point.
Yeah, I think soft is not the word. I think it was an amazing deal for the investors. And I think the Department of Education should take the responsibility of teaching ministers and officials the art of negotiation. The deal is from the time this is built, and you say 2023, maybe it'll be 2023, it could be a bit later now, because the contracts are not actually formally signed. It will be a 35-year deal which starts at double the current wholesale price and is then index-linked for 35 years. If you're in any business, that's a pretty good deal to have. There is no incentive within the deal for the operators to reduce the cost. That, I think, is quite wrong. And the deal was done with one operator, one negotiator, and other companies who could have tried to compete, and some of them tell me they would have come in at a lower price, were not part of those negotiations. So I think it's a very disappointing deal. And as a supporter of new nuclear, as part of the energy mix, I think that this sets a very bad example and will actually undermines the whole argument for a cleaner energy mix, because the cost is so obvious and so long-lasting and takes no account of future potential technological change, which I think is going to produce lower-cost energy.
Okay. Thank you. Jeremy?
You might expect, on behalf of industrial consumers, to be expressing some annoyance at the apparent generosity of the deal, but I'm actually going halfway between Steve and Nick's position on this. There are strategic reasons why it's good to retain nuclear in the mix. There are reasons why the strike price announced may, unfortunately, be rather more realistic than some of the claims of the nuclear industry as to how cheap they can build things. And if you look at the cost overruns at Olkiluoto in Finland and Flamanville, where the EPR reactors are being built elsewhere, less so with delays in China, where I gather things are on track, you would have to say that there's been a history of the nuclear industry, and I don't mean EDF specifically, over-promising in terms of what nuclear can be delivered for, and indeed in the case of the French market and elsewhere, not necessarily having prices that fully reflect the whole internal and external costs of that technology. One thing I would say, so the honest answer is I don't know whether that deal represents good value for money to the consumer, because I don't know where wholesale prices are going to be. They're going to go up from where they are at the moment. Absent high carbon prices, it's not obvious they would go up to £92.5 a megawatt hour. That said, the question is, if you want to decarbonise, if you just care about price, then you wouldn't worry. You just build coal as an alternative to gas if you felt like it, and to hell with the environment. That's one way of approaching these things. If it's just about keeping the lights on at least cost. If you're serious about decarbonising, the question is, what baseload technology is going to give you the biggest bang for your buck, even if it's expensive compared with current energy? And I think there nuclear has a stronger story to tell. That £92.5 a megawatt hour might not seem much different to the £90 or so a megawatt hour that onshore wind will be getting by 2020 under the contract for difference feed-in tariffs. But of course that's for a continuous 24/7 supply, not for an intermittent supply generating perhaps 30% of its rated capacity, perhaps a bit more offshore, with all the attendant backup transmission and distribution costs that come with it. So I think those like-for-like comparisons are not straightforward. But in the low-carbon camp, nuclear appears competitive. The bigger question, which goes beyond what we can discuss perhaps here tonight, I don't know, is whether we can afford deep decarbonisation at all.
Thank you. Steve?
I'll be very, very brief because we could talk about this all night. You'll understand I have to respond. If you were building a gas power station to commission in 2023 based on DEC's central scenarios, it would cost about £90. If gas prices are high, so based on DEC's high scenario, it will cost about £111. The nuclear project will be cheaper than onshore when you take account, but once you take account of the intermittency, it'll be considerably cheaper than offshore at £140 strike price. And indeed, over our 35-year deal, will receive less in support than an offshore project would over 15 years. And in terms of incentive to actually be more efficient, there absolutely is an incentive in the contract. So if we can build it cheaper than we forecast, that is shared with customers essentially. So there is a gain share mechanism. So there's an incentive on us to actually build it cheaper, but we don't win. We don't take all of that money if we are able to do that. It's shared with the customers.
Thank you. I mean, the interesting point that seemed to come up there is around actually the perception of the value of some of these investments in different technologies. So a question for you, Chris, is how much does the public political antenna influence what governments do and don't do? Because to Nick's point, if the conversation has moved away from climate change to price, how much does government take notice? And who are the groups who most are able to influence what government is doing in your view?
Certainly the government takes notice because public mood changes. And in fact, I think we've seen that happening over the course of the last couple of years or so. When a lot of the so-called green tariffs included within electricity prices, for example, were introduced, no one batted an eyelid. Everyone was broadly supportive of them. This was obviously taking things in a sensible direction. It was helping to fuel the development of renewables, etc. The moment that electricity prices become hugely customer sensitive, which they are now, then suddenly everyone starts digging into what makes up the prices. And the so-called green tariffs are a tiny bit of the overall price that the consumer is paying, but they have now become very politically high profile. So yes, these things change, and it changes through public perception, but public perception is driven probably by overall cost, probably more than just overall cost, the increasing cost that people are experiencing.
So when you look at it, and to talk about climate change versus price, when you look at a number of the NGOs who are out there, whether it's WWF or Friends of the Earth, who have typically grown up with a focus on climate change, if the political debate is moving now to a focus on price, what role does an NGO now have if that's the main focus? Because presumably that's a very difficult change for them to make.
It's extremely difficult, and they have to make the green case even more vociferously than they were doing before. Because the need to reduce carbon hasn't gone away. I forget who it was saying there is an issue, can we afford deep decarbonisation? My response to that would be, can we afford not to have deep decarbonisation because of what the impact of continuing use of carbon will have over the course of the next 70 or 80 years. We have to go down this road. We simply have to find the most efficient, the most effective, the cheapest and the most efficient ways of doing it. And that's where the challenge is.
And I suppose I want to move on to a kind of more of a pragmatic conversation around what businesses might do. But Alison, just a quick one for you. When you've worked in energy and in particular sustainability, as well as a number of other roles in your career so far, are you seeing a shift in terminology even? So sustainability now seems to catch a whole range of different topics within it, from energy to diversity and inclusion to environmental policies and a range of different topics. Did you see that change when you were working at Sainsbury's? And is that good for the energy debate, that it's suddenly been changed into a much wider bucket of topics that sit underneath sustainability, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think Chris is right. I mean, the story, the narrative changes almost every 6 months because, I mean, we would focus just on environmental issues, which were hard green issues. So that would be energy efficiency, waste reduction, and a bit of social stuff, really, I suppose, and a bit of community stuff. And then it's devolved into a much more sophisticated language. And then comes sustainable development comes along, and then people say, well, what does that mean, and what's sustainability? And in the end, it comes back to running your business in a good manner so that you deal with your people capital, your environmental capital, your financial capital. So it's, people, planet, profit type stuff, which resonated. And I think a lot of the big corporates, certainly in the FTSE 100, have now got much more sophisticated, comprehensive programs which cover, different buckets of all sorts of stuff under a label or an umbrella, etc. And it's given them a much greater clarity within their organisations to run parallel programs under running a good business, which I think is really good. But even in the energy, if we go back to energy again, that's moved from using less to energy security, so the energy purchaser or procurer, his role has moved up the agenda and profile. The energy manager, the guy in charge of the energy management scheme, this is in the large companies where they can afford to employ these specialists. They appear at the boardroom table, not once a year, but probably maybe twice, 3 times a year, and they've got regular meetings with the CFO, because this is, depending on how large a percentage of your cost base of the business energy accounts for, you've got a part to play, not just in terms of keeping costs down now, but where's the public policy market going, where are the energy suppliers going, what's our business growth programs, and can we afford energy in the future? Or if we don't do anything now, how much of our future profit that we're predicting will be wiped out by what's coming down the road? So I think that the business is changing, and even now they're talking about taking on apprentices, and I'm sorry to go back to this, the guys that will help us keep it all running and motoring and sweet and happy. And even the old world of facilities management, which was always a sinkhole of perhaps less recognition, less competence, less investment within a business. And the FM budget was always one that got cut, and nobody really minded about it because we just staggered on a bit longer. Those people have now got a lot more airtime to say, if you want this to run sweetly, I need preventative maintenance, I want budget. So it's still evolving.
Nick, you want to talk about it?
Yes, I want to agree with Chris that emissions are something we can't afford not to tackle. I think we have to do something about that, but I don't think that we tackle them by going for ever more expensive renewables and alternatives like that. I think that's why I'm so disappointed with Hinkley, which is going to be the most expensive nuclear station ever built anywhere in the world. And I think that just sends the wrong signal on this. And I think I don't think there's an actual trade-off that we can't transcend. And I think the way to transcend it is to focus on efficiency. If this country used energy as efficiently as Japan does, we'd use 40% less. That cuts bills and it cuts emissions. And I would much rather see the government, any government, it's not a political point, focus on that rather than going as they are at the moment.
So subsidies from the Germans, best practice from the Japanese?
I think, I wouldn't go to subsidies on the German model. I think that's not working either. But I would certainly go to look at Japan and how both business, domestic, commercial sectors use energy, how they build them into the whole system, because I think that's just a very good starting point for saving money and saving emissions.
Alison, and then Andrew, I think there's a comment from the floor as well.
Our manufacturing business base, our commercial business base really understands lean management, Sigma 6 and all the rest of it, all of which we've learnt from the Japanese, to be brutally honest. So why can we not take that on? I mean, I think that would be a really interesting
lean on
new
staff
thing.
Rather than...
Well, no, it's lean on resources, and energy is a resource, and it's an expensive one.
I just wanted to come in on a couple of things, actually, because I think there's some very interesting themes emerging here. One was Alison's point about the changing narrative. And I think on that, I would just like to share our own journey. I mean, we're obviously a very big organisation. We've got buildings, facilities all over the globe. And in 2012, we spent £102 million on our energy bill. Now, that's an enormous amount of money for a multinational. I mean, it's probably not out of whack with other companies of similar size. We, because that's such a large element of cost, have set ourselves some pretty demanding targets and driving that down. And as a result of the journey that we've been on, which starts fairly simply by finding how can you determine how you're actually using the energy. And in most large companies, probably small ones as well, you don't even have the data to start with. The purchasing decisions are probably made at lots of local levels. There is no aggregation. You don't even know where you're spending the money. So the first thing is education, find out where are we spending money. And then you start looking building by building. We just did an energy audit on the building next door, and we discovered all sorts of slightly odd things, such as there was a slightly higher level of usage during the night than during the day. Now, we work hard, but we're not generally here 24/7. So there's clearly something strange there, and it's about optimizing your heating and your lighting and so on. So that's some sort of easy wins. What we then have been trying to do is to try and share that with our corporate clients, because what we've learned and what we're still learning, I will admit, we've set ourselves some pretty stretching targets. We are going to try and reduce our CO2 intensity by 15% by the end of this year from 2012 levels. So that's a pretty big ask. What we learn through our facilities colleagues, we're now trying to share with our corporate customers, because we think they are in the same sort of situation. They all have an energy bill, but in many cases they don't have the relative luxury of a dedicated manager or management team to look at this. And the second point I wanted to make, actually going to the broader debate about awareness and policy and acceptability of subsidy or other policy interventions, I think as an industry we've been pretty poor in articulating how the energy sector works in this or indeed any other country. If you go out on the street and ask people, roughly what percentage of your electricity comes from gas, from coal, from wind, from anything else, I sort of doubt that most people are going to have a perspective on that. And yet, as Steve rightly said, the decisions we make over the next couple of years are 30 to 50-year decisions in most cases on these large investments. And so what I would love, it's probably a bit of a pipe dream, but I would really, really like and welcome a much more open debate through the media, actually, which is having a great time in sensationalising, politicising all of this, and perhaps we'll come back to that later. Some facts, some basis on which the consumer, be they domestic or corporate, can actually make a slightly more informed set of decisions. Because right now, I don't think anybody really, unless they're in the energy sector and lives and breathes it, is able to form a perspective on, are we better off with a mix that's more wind, more solar, nuclear, which part does it play? I think that's something that actually as a country, if we're about to make decisions to spend billions of pounds, and we're talking about 110 billion pounds of new investment into the energy sector by the end of 2020, that's a lot of money. Can we have a proper debate about that?
Thank you. What was the point you wanted to make? Christian, if you've got the microphone. Again, if you could just say your name and which organisation you're from, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Good evening. My name's Dave Raval from Loft Zone, and I have a question about the energy efficiency point that some people have been making. So next week, the Energy Savings Trust is going to downgrade its estimates of the benefits we get from various measures like new boilers and insulation, etc. We don't know what those numbers are, but the Guardian had an estimate that it's going to go for loft insulation down from £180 a year to £15. And that's set in the context of the government having changed the whole industry away from a grant-based system onto a private finance system called the Green Deal, which has caused the sector to collapse by about 90% year on year. So everyone says energy efficiency is the most important thing to do, but in this country at least, the sector's in crisis, if not almost completely on its knees. So what have we done wrong, and what can we do differently?
You coughed, so you
yes.
get to answer the question.
What we've done wrong is we haven't looked at what works and what doesn't work. There have been endless attempts to get schemes of making the energy companies help you through your bill. The Green Deal, which it isn't even off the starting blocks. it's been a huge disappointment, I suspect, to the government. The things that worked were done on a very local level by very imaginative and enterprising local authorities. The most obvious is Kirklees, which is in Yorkshire, where they went street by street, knocking on doors, talking to people, and saying, we will do this all for you. We will have a look at your house. We'll recommend what you need in order to improve your energy efficiency. We will then organise all the work, and we'll come in and do it for you. And what they did was they did it on a micro level, and they took all the hassle out of it for the householder. As a result, hugely successful, massive take-up, enormous benefit for the people who live there. It's absolutely the only way you'll do it. If you do it by having some highfalutin finance thing that requires the consumer to make all the decisions, to take all the action, to endure all the hassle, it's just not going to take off.
So you're saying almost regardless of price and regardless of the climate change debate, or regardless of people's political or personal family views, actually it's the hassle factor that's probably the biggest element.
It's clearly the complexity. And having been rude about EDF, let me say that they and other people have tried their best within a system that is just too complex for ordinary people. I mean, one of the papers, I think it might have been The Guardian, it might have been the FT, actually sent some of their staff to try and work through the process. And these are pretty bright people, and they found it too difficult. So I think it's that complexity. And the wins, as Chris rightly says, they should be local. You should have people going around helping through a much simpler process. There should be local plans related to specific areas. Combined heat and power, all sorts of things can be done. And I'm very sorry the government hasn't done them. Other countries in Europe do much better on that.
And is that the same for small businesses? And I suppose my next question would be around, is that the same for smaller businesses versus larger businesses who might have... we'll take a question from the floor, and then maybe we can come back to that point. And I know, Andy, you want to make a point as well.
Hello, Jim Watts from the Cabinet Office, formerly DEFRA. Just to sort of come back onto the point about energy efficiency, one of the more interesting pieces of legislation that's recently come out of Europe in this area has been the Energy Efficiency Directive, which was adopted by the Commission and the European Council back in October 2012. And that actually seeks to bring together, codify a lot of existing legislation in this area, and bring together what's seen by the Commission as exemplifying good practice. So it includes things like local, centralised, combined heat and power, encouraging energy companies to provide more regular updates to customers on their energy usage, so that with the belief they can then sort of take the necessary action, encouraging government to invest more in energy efficient technology, goods and services. So it's kind of interesting to see that at the European level there seems to be quite a lot of movement to bring together a lot of this practice. But I think if I have a question, sort of moving on from that, one of the interesting...
be on the panel.
One of the interesting points about this kind of nexus between sustainability, energy efficiency and productivity, in a sense, is that very often you find, and it's a principle which has been known about since Victorian times, it's called the Jevons paradox, is that when you make a process more energy efficient and you thereby sort of lower the cost of doing it, that you can then unintentionally stimulate the market and you get more people, actually sort of, more activity, which in turn then leads to increased energy usage unintentionally. So I'm just wondering how the panel see us dealing with, in a sense, unintended consequences of energy efficiency, particularly when we're dealing with a growing population, for instance, that will have increased energy demands.
Thank you.
And I don't want to sort of gainsay all the good work that's being done by RBS and other firms as well, but...
Thank you for that. Jeremy, do you have a point?
Yes, firstly, in response to is industry or business the same as the domestic sector, broadly speaking, the more energy intensive you are, the less you are like a domestic consumer. It's not about how large or small the firm is, although plainly larger companies have the facility to have energy purchasers and managers in the way small businesses find it more difficult to do. But if you're a steelworks where 25% plus of your operating costs are energy related, if it's an aluminium smelter it might be 40-45%, for industrial gases and chlorine production 70% or so of your operating costs are energy. You don't have to be told about the importance of it. It's a board level issue. Irrespective of environmental or reputational concerns, you've got a strong reason to use it efficiently, and most of those industries, by the way, are also got part of negotiated climate change agreements with government and therefore have obligations to deliver anyway.
And some of them are being very successful at it.
Yeah, that's right.
The cement industry has reduced its energy use by about 20%.
Exactly, and that's a great thing. In certain sectors, the progress has been greater than expected. In others, it's tightening, and the I try to avoid the cliche of low-hanging fruit, but it's impossible, so I've just said it. In others, that's been taken, and you're up against diminishing returns, and a process as good as, asymptotically moving towards theoretical maximum energy efficiency, although you never quite get there. I think the mistake would be to expect the domestic consumer is ever going to be in that boat. Some of us might be because we're techie geeks and we like to analyse the thing, and we've already got those meters that I'm not sure they fully qualify as being smart, but they tell you about all sorts of stuff that you can analyse and stick on spreadsheets, which keeps geeky people like me happy. But most people have a life instead, and it's not surprising. Therefore, if you want incentives for them, it's got to be some other institutional arrangement that assists them rather than making their life more complicated. Very quickly on the so-called Jevons paradox, very good point. Whenever someone raises this, the fact that energy efficiency savings reduce the real cost of a unit of energy, and as any economist will tell you, if you do that, you therefore increase the demand, or even if there's an income effect, every pound saved on an energy price is a pound you can spend on something else or put towards your next weekend EasyJet trip to Prague or whatever it happens to be, which may have a higher carbon footprint than the thing is. This doesn't mean, please don't think this means energy efficiency is unimportant, quite the opposite. It's part of what's going to make more efficiency in the economy generally and make the low carbon agenda and the decarbonisation, which is not cheap, more affordable than it otherwise would be. So it ticks all those boxes. However, it is a mistake in public policy to assume that the rebound effect is zero, or because they don't know what it is, to not make an assumption about it. It was one of the weaknesses in the Stern Review of the Economics and Climate Change is that 40% of the assumed savings in CO2 were expected to be achieved at zero or negative cost through energy efficiency saving without any allowance having been brought in this analysis for rebound effects. A criticism which I understand in private he now acknowledges is something that should have been put right. That doesn't necessarily mean the conclusions are wrong. It does mean that it's going to be slightly more expensive and perhaps a little bit more problematic, because changing behaviour in, I don't know what the figures are, 26 million households or something in this country is a world away from changing something in a couple of dozen power stations.
Nick, you wanted to make a point?
I think just one other point on the, particularly business, but it also does affect households as well, is that this is also a bit of a paradox, that energy efficiency is made worse by low growth, because so much of energy efficiency depends on the capital stock. And if the capital stock is not being turned over, it's not being improved to the highest new standards on a global basis, then you stick with the system you have in the past. And I think the numbers show this. Maybe our colleague from DEFRA can tell me if I've got this wrong, that the fastest period of energy efficiency improvement in this country was the 10 years of continuous growth from 1997 to 2007, and that the slowest period has been the last 5 years when economic growth has been so low.
You mean in terms of house purchases?
Per capita, I think the measure is energy per unit of GDP.
So this comes back to, if you buy a new house, you're
Yes,
accepting
you
you're in
use the
chaos,
new
you're accepting hassle, so you're likely to invest in upgrading, improving. So it's like that sort of window of opportunity.
All that. And if you have a new car, you're like each new generation of cars is much more efficient than the last.
On that point about windows of opportunity, is that something that is a similar concept for consumers and for business?
Yes, I think it is.
And how would that work in practice? Has anyone got any examples? I know, Alison, you've talked about it
Yeah,
a little bit.
When just take householders first. I think, Nick, your point about when you move house or you buy a new car or you buy a new washing machine, on the whole, we're fairly rational. Sometimes we're irrational, but being able to make a step change when you replace something or move is a good opportunity. I mean, I would love to see some sort of rebate on your stamp duty if you can prove that you've had sort of bona fide or energy efficiency installations in your house, for example. If you could take them businesses, a business, if it's going to build a new factory, build a new store, build a new premise, it will cluster a whole load of design, technology, thinking, practice, proven experience into one package and then try and deliver it. So you've got that window of doing something about it. If you're going to extend a business or refurbish a premise or a building, you've got the chance to cluster a whole lot of activity. The trick is to have the test sites, the test experience to build up a knowledge package so that when you deliver it for the next opportunity for intervention, you can get it all done in one place. And you've got the planning and the experience and the monitoring and the contractors that can deliver it for you. But I think there is a view, certainly if you have lots of multi-sites like yourself and retailers, they're looking at one touch and you do everything at that time.
I'll just quote one very quick business example, which I think matches that. When I worked for BP, one of the things I was doing was looking at why the big refinery and chemical plant we had at Grangemouth was so inefficient relative to so many other plants around the world, including in the way it used energy. And the reason was that it started to be built in the 19th century, and it had been put together piece by piece over a century. It had never been completely taken down and built again, whereas the new petrochemical plants in the Gulf or Japan or now the Far East start from scratch. They use the absolute new technology, and that technology includes energy efficiency, because that's a big cost. It's much harder to do that on an old site to retrofit in a place like Grangemouth.
And Steve, from your perspective, you're presumably talking as EDF to customers, both business and consumers. What best practices do you see in the business world of how firms and when firms are looking to try and reduce their energy costs? What's a typical project or best practice that you've seen?
I mean, one really good example is a deal that we did with Morrison's Supermarket. And again, this was an interesting deal because we took a look at their business, but then we went in on a promise, if you like. So we sort of said, we committed that we could find them £1 million worth of savings, by going around their business, and we didn't know for certain that we would be able to do that. But we got hold of EDF's top R&D sort of folks, because EDF invests a lot in research and development, and applied them to it, and just systematically worked through it. And you were saying to me earlier, Alison, every time you walk around the block, there is always more you can do. Always. And we absolutely smashed the target, and it's I think both parties are very happy with the deal.
Any other questions or points from the audience? Yes, again. Christian, you have to run really quickly to the front.
Morelli from BP. So I had a question around, given that now climate change is no longer sexy, people are not really talking about a green energy anymore, how do we encourage international, multinational companies to actually focus on renewables, alternative energy, when there is enough oil and gas to really last us for a very long time? What needs to change? Because that's what.
Chris, is this something you want to pick up?
On the whole, the world of business is much more clued up about climate change still than most politicians, most governments, and most broad public opinion. Because intelligent business leaders are thinking reasonably long term. They know that it hasn't gone away. If you look at all the studies that have been done, just asking business leaders about the assumptions they're making about climate change, they're still very much on the page. It's something very striking in America, for example, getting any movement on climate change out of Congress, impossible. There is absolutely no way that the entirety of the Republican Party and the Democrats from the Rust Belt states are ever going to move on this. However much the administration wants to. But if you look at what American business is doing, there are a large number of companies that are making huge strides in reducing their energy, reducing carbon footprint, and so on. So I think let's not be too pessimistic. The other point I would make is that if you talk with people about the environment or about climate change as a broad concept, whereas 5-6 years ago they would have been really up for it. This is general public, voters. Now way down the list of their concerns. It's nowhere near up the top. But if you talk to them about their own patch of environment, about the river that runs through their town, about the woods that are just outside where they live, about the impact that increasingly erratic weather is having on the fields and their flood risk, for example, then yes, they are absolutely up for it. And what we need to try and do is make the connection between the local and personal, which is still very much very strong with them, and the broader issues.
A point from Andy, and then a chap at the front, and then maybe a couple more points, and maybe we've got a chance for 1 or 2 questions. I'm conscious of time.
No, very quickly, I absolutely agree with all Chris's points there that multinationals are, by and large, well informed on this. I think where it gets interesting, though, is when you're looking at green tech, if you want to call it that, as an investment opportunity. I'm often in fora where you have this sort of sense that there's a little bit of a feeling of entitlement. And I think this comes from the days when, particularly the renewables developers were a small industry. It was very much us against the rest of the world, and there were many skeptics. And I think we've come an awful long way from that now, where it is now a mainstream business in its own right. But there are still quite often these rather interesting debates where people say, but why aren't investors, why aren't pension funds and institutional investors putting more money into renewables? And there I think the harsh reality is that they just make very solid business decisions. They're going to look at their allocation and say, well, I can invest in this offshore wind farm in Germany, or I can invest in a hospital project in France, or whatever it might be. And they're actually just making really hard-nosed decisions. And there, I think, we come right back to the policy piece to a degree, because when you're asking somebody to commit their capital to support development of something that is lower or zero carbon, they're evaluating, they've got a bunch of different investment opportunities that they can put their money into, and they're just making a pretty hard-nosed decision as to, is this the best combination of risk versus return? I think we do very much need to get the low-carbon sector away from this view, which does still exist in certain parts of it, that there is some inherent goodness in doing things. I absolutely personally believe that that's the case, and that we should all be striving towards a much lower carbon sector production. But for this to happen, it has to make business sense as well. Otherwise, it won't get built, and we will be reliant on subsidy, and that's not a secure base for future growth.
Thank you. There was a point at the beginning here, and then Nick and Alison, I'll come to you.
Tural Veli, BP. So I'm actually surprised that our speakers didn't talk much about shale gas. Most of the international oil and gas companies, for them, it's a very interesting development. So I would like to ask you, do you see it as a game changer in the world, and especially in Europe, the way that it was developed in the US and changed the whole energy market in the US? Can we see the same transformation in Europe as well?
Thank you. Nick, and then maybe Jeremy?
Okay. Can I first answer the previous question just very quickly? I don't think the existing energy multinationals are going to be the people who lead the change. I think they will stick to their existing skills and activities. I think there'll be second movers if this becomes a really commercial business. And I think the people who will lead it are the insurgent companies, both on the science side with the new technology and on the retail side. And I think the step that we haven't quite seen yet is Google Energy or Amazon Energy. I think that at some point we will see that, and they are the people who will change the market. On shale gas, it clearly is an international game changer. I think what's happened in the US has diverted gas. The US used to be an importer, now it's neutral in the market, and it may soon be an exporter. I think that shale gas around the world, if it can be found and developed on a commercial scale in China, in Eastern Europe, in Argentina, in Mexico, and so on, where people are looking and putting serious money, that is going to change the international gas market beyond recognition. It's one of the reasons I think that prices will come down rather than going up. It just changes the balance of supply and demand. I don't think there's quite so much here. I think it's being hyped a bit. There's some. I think there's only one well being actually drilled, and I'm told there's only one planning permission for another well in line at the moment. So it's not going to happen very quickly. I think it is positive if it helps to reduce coal use. I wouldn't expect it to change the UK energy market in the next 10 years.
Thank you. And Jeremy, I think you had a point to make.
Some of our members are more optimistic about the extent to which it could change the energy market, but I stress could, not would, and we may be talking about something that's going to have more profound effects well into the 2020s and across Europe, if it does, rather than in the UK specifically, because as others have pointed out elsewhere, the UK is part of a European market. And in my opening remarks, I mentioned that gas is not internationally priced the way oil is, that there are regional markets for gas. My God, I wish energy-intensive industries and others here had the gas prices we've got in the United States at the moment. They may or may not be sustainably at that level. I suspect they can only go one way from where they are at the moment, and part of it is being in an oversupplied market without the ability yet to export on a significant scale, a position we were in the UK in the 1990s when we were, in quotes, awash with gas. And we flattered ourselves when I remember the fuss when gas went up from 12 to 15 pence a therm. Those were the days. It's like oil going up to $15 a barrel and complaining about it. I don't expect we're going to see American absolute levels of prices, but even if we don't, even if we get halfway there, even if the costs of exploiting in the rather more densely populated, and if I may say so, better environmentally regulated Europe than in some states in America, even if those costs are higher and there are political barriers too, there's no reason to think that there won't be a considerable resource here. Even if we don't reduce gas prices, it's good for security of supply. It's actually better for the overall emissions footprint than liquefying gas and bringing it in from the Middle East. So I'd like to see British industry being part of that. I'd like to see the decarbonisation, the substitution of gas for coal happen here the way it did in the 1990s when our first dash for gas, and the way it's happening in America. I don't care if something's happening because of environmental regulation. I do care about the consequences of it.
We've actually had a comment that's come in by email is around fracking and public perception. So Chris, you made the point around most people we want to try and make the conversation more local. Is fracking a good example of where actually in the longer term it could help in certain cases lower prices and could help from an environmental perspective, but the impact is felt locally? So is there a clash between the perception of what shale gas is or fracking is and what impact it might have on the wider environmental debate and what actually happens in one person's backyard, for want of a better phrase?
There's certainly a clash between perception and reality. And we are the principal regulator of shale gas exploration. It is not the demon that some in some parts of the green movement would have us believe. It is perfectly possible to frack sustainably and safely, provided the right regulatory regime and monitoring is properly in place. I suspect neither is it the answer to all our energy needs and requirements, which sometimes some people claim for it. There is potentially quite a bit of it, mostly under the Forest of Bowland, but there are other bits around the rest of the country. I very much hope that over the course of the next few years, we find ways of exploiting it safely and properly, because very much like Jeremy, substituting gas for coal will absolutely help our carbon footprint. It's not a permanent long-term solution, but as a step towards a permanent long-term solution, it could be very valuable.
Thank you. Any other points from the audience? Yes, there's a gentleman at the back.
Yeah, I guess I look at shale a little bit differently.
So if you could just say...
Tom Fox from BP.
We're full of BP this evening.
Yeah, there's quite a few of us, yeah. I guess I just look at shale a bit differently, and I wonder if the panel might have thoughts on the fact that you kind of add cheaper fossil to the mix. It basically drives any current subsidy and incentive for the low-carbon, high-cost alternatives down the road. So even if you do have this temporary blip because you're swapping out coal for shale, effectively it's undermining the entire renewables complex, which is always going to be more expensive for the time being until tech brings it in line.
I think that's a really good question, because actually we're seeing that in effect in Germany right now. You've got, as we've said, the low-cost gas in the US means that coal, which was formerly being burned in the US, is now not being burned in the US. It's on the world market. Its price has fallen. So we have this really paradoxical situation of Germany, which has been actually at the forefront of driving towards a low-carbon industry and a low-carbon generation sector, still with a huge chunk of wind generation, masses of solar PV, and burning lots of coal. Because the other thing that's happened is they've turned off their nukes in the reaction to Fukushima. So you've got this really strange impact, and we're seeing that in this country as well. I mean, at the moment, the average level of load of coal in the UK is probably around about 40%, something like that. Steve, you probably... I haven't looked at my numbers today, but yeah. And, you know, that has risen significantly. So we're burning less gas in the UK because it's more expensive right now, and coal has become cheaper because of the impact of shale in the US. And this is paradoxical, but we do operate in a global energy market. So you've got this very perverse outcome with lots of renewables and coal being burned in Germany. It's not what anybody designed that system to do, but that's where we are now, because it's economics that drives it.
And a point of view, Chris.
I agree that is the first order effect of shale gas, particularly in the US, is to reduce coal prices, change the international coal market. But I don't think it stops there. I think the next effect, which we're beginning to see, I think, in solar, is that market pressures reduce costs. And I think that what it's doing is taking out of some parts of the renewable sector the rent that was provided by guaranteed subsidies. And I think we will see more of that. And then the next challenge is to really press the renewables industry to be competitive without subsidy. And I think that that's the medium-term challenge, which would be great to see.
Thank you very much indeed. It's been just slightly over an hour and 50 minutes. So thank you once again for RBS for hosting this radio space. Thank you very much indeed to all of the panel for answering so eloquently, and thank you to everyone who asked the questions. And equally, for the first time, thank you to everyone who's joined us online. I hope you enjoyed it, and any feedback, please send it in to us. A couple of other events we've got coming up. On February the 11th, we've got an event around business ethics. So we've got a really interesting panel. We've got the head of compliance for Amex, the head of corporate and social responsibility for BAE Systems, the research director from the Institute of Business Ethics, as well as a professor on Christianity and business ethics from Cambridge, and Sir Paul Jenkins from the Treasury Solicitor's Office. Then got the future of transport on March the 11th, where we've got the chairman of Crossrail and also the PPS for the Transport Secretary, and Richard Barnes, who's a former Deputy Mayor of London and on the board of TfL. He also investigated or led the investigation into the London 7/7 bombing. So we'll be talking about London versus the world, and how do you look to invest and build a transport infrastructure for a city when you want to compete globally. So there are some of the things coming up. Finally, there are feedback forms, and again, it's the first time we've done feedback forms. We talked to you all informally, but if you would be prepared to jot down a few thoughts and comments, we're trying and striving to make this ever better. So we hope you've enjoyed this evening. There's drinks next door. There's also an event launching a book around inspirational women or female leaders. So we're going to mix the two audiences. So if anyone's interested to meet some inspirational female leaders other than the ones we have in the audience here, you're very welcome to go next door, and vice versa. Some of them might come and join us as well. Other than that, thank you very much indeed for your time today. And any questions, the panel and each of you will hopefully be around for a drink from now on. Thank you very much.